Hello everybody and welcome to the Aviation Show, and it's time. We're talking space shuttles, and we've got Dr. Jennifer Levasseur with us here, and again, silly, my Ellie even is still ill, so I'm doing the selfie cam. But really, Jennifer, how did you get such an awesome gig as a museum curator looking after things like this?
Well, it's been a long road, so I started here kind of at the bottom of the curatorial ranks. I came here as a graduate of a master's program, was working on just documentation and helping out around the space history department, and within a few years realized I really want to be a curator. And so in 2005, so I've been here for 22 years, in 2005 I decided to go and get my PhD in history. And so over the course of time, got that PhD, became responsible for some collections, and then really kind of hit it big, I suppose you could say. In 2019, we had a retirement in the department for the Space Shuttle curator, and so I took over that job. So for the last 5 years now, I've been the Space Shuttle and International Space Station curator, which is great. I still curate a few other things that are really my passion, which are astronaut chronographs, so the watches that astronauts wear, and also I'm a specialist on space food, and also cameras. And so, you know, anytime I'm doing a filmed interview, I'm always, amazed at the capabilities that we have today to do filming. It's always just kind of mind-boggling.
Yes. this thing is quite something. But, so you get to play with all the Omegas, do you? Or Omegas, depending on which part of the world
Right, that's
you're from.
true. I wouldn't say I play with them, but I definitely get to handle them. We loan them out quite extensively across the world. They're in museums on loan. We have a few here in the museum, but it is an incredible privilege to have gotten to work so closely in a few instances with specific astronauts who really had a very intimate, obviously anybody who wears a watch knows, it's an intimate thing for your body. It's like, after my clothes, it's the next thing I put on. Yeah. So it's a really big deal. So seeing that translate to the astronaut world is always really interesting.
Fantastic. Astronaut food. Is it the same sort of stuff as we get in the gift shop, or is it?
No, everyone asks that, and I have to say it's one of my missions in life to debunk the dehydrated ice cream or that foamy nonsense that you get. My children don't even like it, thankfully. So
it's something we all have had once and think, those poor men.
Right. There are very related items. So one of the things I always like to tell people is that the food that astronauts eat today is very much like things you can get in your own grocery store. So the packaging is very similar. Anything that you might get that's shelf stable. So there's things like fishes. So you can get obviously like a package of tuna or salmon that's in a sealed, not a can, but a bag, and you could tear off that top. That's something that astronauts could eat as well. They do have dehydrated foods. Those are common because it removes the water, but they always rehydrate them. So that's what makes that ice cream in the gift shop a little bit of a kind of a nonsense item, is that that's not really how they eat ice cream. They do get ice cream. It comes up on a freezer, so it's real and awesome.
And heavy.
Yes, very, very true.
Super. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this around, because nobody needs to see me.
Or me, for that matter.
This isn't. So, tell us a little bit about Discovery, because a couple of weeks ago I got to speak to Jan Davis, and she's going to come back to tell us about flying on it.
Yeah.
She said she loved it. For you looking after it here at the Udvar-Hazy Center, what's it like?
It's really surreal. I mean, I was a child in the 1980s watching the Space Shuttle program get off the ground. And so to really become a part of the story in a strange way, in this very tangential way, feels unreal. So I was, a fourth grader sitting on a classroom floor in January of 1986 and was obviously as shocked and saddened by everything that day, watching Challenger break apart over the Atlantic Ocean. And now it gives me the chills every time I start talking about it. I've come full circle that I'm back in those moments. And that moment really comes back to me quite a bit in my job, is thinking about everything that led up to that moment, all of the work that went into developing the space shuttle, creating the space shuttle, flying the space shuttle, operating the space shuttle, and then having that happen as well as part of the story, and being a person who then gets to tell that story and explain it and help people digest what it all means and what spaceflight is about. is really a privilege. I mean, to be in this position. So I love it. I always kind of joke around that Discovery is my third child, but she happens to be the oldest of all of them. She's as old as me, frankly, so it's a little bit of an unusual situation. She doesn't require the same level of care that my children require, but I like to think of our role as caretakers of any artifact that we have in the collection. The Space Shuttle just happens to be one of the largest ones of those pieces in the collection. And so I curate things that are all the way down to the size of, coins, all the way up to something this size. And it's really magical getting to play a role in continuing Discovery's display for whoever may come to visit the vehicle for years and years to come.
Because this is, just to sort of pan around, as I've been trying to get the scale of just how big the UHC is.
Yeah.
And then, we've seen some of the bigger aircraft there. We've looked at the Redstone earlier. This thing is massive.
Yeah, it is. It's a bit unwieldy in its own way, which is one of the reasons it's great to work in a museum. You don't have to move it around once it's in place. There's thankfully not much that has to happen in terms of managing it. We do take quite a bit of care and we do observe what happens because things do change. Obviously we have a barrier around the vehicle so that people are discouraged from going up and touching it. One of the things that you learn very early in museum life and museum training is that the oils on your hands are basically terrible for almost anything you're trying to preserve. So if you want that thing to last a really long time, you don't want your fingerprints on it. So we need to be very careful. We limit the amount even we need to touch the vehicle. As a vehicle that has been flown in space, and this is true of aircraft that have flown in the sky as well, is there are fluids that are inside the vehicle that for the most part can't ever be permanently drained. And so we do have to go into the vehicle about every year or two to see if those fluids are causing any problems. These are mostly hydraulic fluids at this point. So we have a little entryway that we can go and take a look at if you want. And we crawl in there, and it's a really complex area, but there's lots of tubes and pipes, and you can see inside. We get to see inside and see what's happening with those things and see if anything's dripping and take care of any drips and clean things up and make sure that it's good for now. And if you look at our aircraft, however, the aircraft, all of those hydraulic fluids will leak out onto the floor if we don't protect the floor. So really we put down little pads, absorbent pads to protect it. And we do the same thing, it's just you can't see it in Discovery, it's in the back. So it's nice and tidy, it looks clean. You obviously need to take care of things like dust. We have lots of things that are just circulating through the air. We all know about much more now in the post-pandemic world about things that circulate through our air. Dust is one of those. We all know in our own homes, the dust lands on things, you need to keep it clean. So we do dust the vehicle from time to time. And we make sure that anything that we need to do as a museum inside that barrier is very carefully done with a mindfulness towards not touching or impacting the vehicle in any way. So it's a bit of a hands-off approach, really, which is let's just avoid touching it.
So what was the condition that you received her in after her last flight? Which was when? That's true.
Last flight was April of 2011. And we received Discovery in April of 2012. So 1 year later, the vehicle was made safe for display. And what that means is any of the compartments, the engine compartments that had any toxic fuels in them needed to be removed. So when you look at the front of the vehicle here, this sort of sloped up section here, you can see some rocket nozzles in the front here.
Let's go have a look.
So this is the forward engine compartment. This is what we call the reaction control system. And that's where those are the engines you would have used in orbit to maneuver the vehicle. And in orbit, they burned a toxic fuel, basically. And so what you see here is just the exterior of that section. There is nothing on the inside of that. So if we were to just peel away a few layers of this, it would be sort of an empty container. And the same is true for what we call the OMS pods, which are the big bumps that come out of either side of the vehicle in the rear. Those had the same kinds of toxic chemicals in them. They were used for the same purposes, which is maneuvering in orbit. And so those have also been emptied out. So they are just shells. And the other major feature that was taken out of the orbiter before it arrived were really the working parts of the engines. So there are 3 main engines at the back. You can see that there are engine nozzles that come out, but really the heart of each of those engines has been removed, and that's because they were going to be reused and have been reused for the Artemis program. And so even Discovery was a contributor to what we're doing today in spaceflight, even though it's been now 14 years basically since the vehicle's last use. And so there's kind of an ongoing life out there, which is also kind of a cool part of the story.
Yes. We won't talk about Artemis.
Sounds fine.
Yeah. But
it's a little too TBD for me right now.
Yes. As a Canadian waiting for a Canadian to go into space, it's getting a bit silly.
Yeah, and I've met Jeremy. He's lovely. So. Well,
that's good. That's good to know.
Yeah.
I've spoken to Chris Hadfield's agent, who is lovely, and just not Chris yet. But
yeah.
I've read so much about these troublesome tiles, and I guess the question really is, now that the orbiter is here, are they troublesome? Do you ever walk in of a morning and one is no longer where it should be?
Thankfully, no. We have not lost any full tiles. They're, as you can imagine, they are very fragile, which is kind of the dual nature of these as protection for a vehicle. They are very, very heat resistant. These black tiles, which mostly cover the vehicle, can resist temperatures up to about 2,300 degrees. Actually, it's a little less than that. The reinforced carbon-carbon, which is the highest heat resistance, is the gray nose cone and then the wing leading edges. Those are receiving the most heating. That goes up, they could protect up to about 3,000 degrees, which is about the re-entry temperature of the vehicle when it was coming through the atmosphere. So they had to be very heat resistant, but they're made of a baked silica product, and that is a very fragile thing. You could take one of these and just lightly let go of it and it would smash on the floor because it's so fragile. So yes, we have to take extra care that nothing happens to them. There are impact sites where there was breakage in that surface, and over time, those things may fall off. So there might be debris found on the floor underneath the vehicle from time to time, which we clean up. But for the most part, thankfully, we don't have to worry about full-size tiles coming off. They were glued onto, there's a sort of barrier layer underneath them. They're glued on pretty strongly, which is really great. We're hoping we don't have to deal with anything like that for a long time.
Because that's one of the sort of great misnomers in something like this, is especially with the carbon-carbon, which anyone who's watched the Columbia documentaries realize that something may be incredibly good in a certain parameter, but poor in another.
Yeah, and that's one of the lessons learned certainly of the shuttle program, and kind of moving towards another style of thermal protection system is, you have to remember that we came from an era where these ablative heat shields were really the way to go, and they had a resin in them that would just kind of slough off as the vehicle passed through these really high temperature zones of the atmosphere. To make a reusable vehicle, though, you needed to have something that you could replace, and that was one of the brilliant aspects of this system, is that if there was a small crack, a small piece, a section that came out, it could be kind of carved out and then filled in so that you didn't have to redo the entire surface. And so the shuttle's story is really dependent on the reusability of this thermal protection system, because if it doesn't have one that you can easily work on when the vehicle is on the ground, you can't get that process to go smoothly every single time the vehicle comes back. You have to be able to bring it back safely in order to redo those tiles to send it back up. So it's kind of a really interesting cycle where tiles, and there's something in the neighborhood of 22,000 tiles on the vehicle. You can even tell to some degree which ones are newer and which ones are older based on what they look like. Now, we think only a fraction of these are actually replacements. The vast majority are still the original tiles that flew on Discovery on its very first mission, which was STS-41D. And that's pretty amazing to think that over 22,000 tiles, you retain the vast majority of those. It's kind of mind-boggling to think that that's possible.
Because that's the urban myth about it, is that the tiles were the problem. And to know that Discovery's
Yeah,
held hers for quite a while.
Yeah, it was a very successful, I would say, way of doing things. What NASA and its partners are now doing is looking for ways that and this is what's true of the Artemis program, is if you look at an image of Artemis 1 prior to flight, you'll notice black tiles that look pretty close to what this is. And so what they did was actually create a hybrid system between an ablative system and this kind of thermal protection where you've got tiles that are reusable. And that's one of the concessions kind of made in thinking in a sort of forward-looking way, is finding ways that work in multiple, you can have multiple different solutions to a problem. And so now Artemis has something, and while we know now that the heat shield, the underside of the heat shield didn't really work exactly as they had hoped, there's certainly hope for how things will be done next time. And so thankfully, we're still learning lessons from the Space Shuttle program even today.
Brilliant. Let's walk down to the business end.
The business end, yes.
Because that's extraordinary, because I've only ever seen Enterprise.
Okay. Enterprise used to sit in this place.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Up until the day that Discovery was rolled over here, Enterprise was here in this spot. We had had Enterprise in our collection since 1986. And then with the retirement of the shuttle program as a whole, NASA needed to work with museums around the country to decide how exactly would those orbiters find the appropriate homes. And Discovery, as the most flown vehicle, gets the place of honor in the Smithsonian collection. And so Enterprise was moved up to New York, which I've seen it there. I've actually seen all of the orbiters in their final locations, and it's very magical to see any of them at this point, I think.
So you've seen Endeavour?
I have. I was actually privileged enough to get to attend the move of Endeavour last January, so I got to see it move from its sort of horizontal to a vertical and then brought over the top of the building and into place. It was also an incredibly magical experience. I can say that people who are involved with the space shuttles in any capacity at any point in time really have a passion for them. These are sort of like family members to all of them as well, which again, makes me feel incredibly privileged to become part of that family in the last few years and get to know many of those people. They really care about the vehicles. They care about their longevity as museum pieces. We want to see these last for generations. And so it's really our job to take the first steps in that direction.
I have been nagging Dennis to come on the show for a long time.
I can understand the complications with getting Dennis on board. He's a hard person to get a hold of.
I think his last message was just read the books.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that is a feat if you can manage that. His books are really intense. So, we always think of them as the encyclopedia of the space shuttle. It's really just such a wealth of information. And that's one of the things that, like I said, is cool about getting to know anybody associated with the vehicles during their history is they have intimate knowledge. And I've talked to some astronauts about this. Is one of the things I learned when Discovery got here that I've not forgotten is each of the vehicles it's just like you think of a car. You can have 5 different models of the same exact car, and they all behave completely differently. They all have their own quirks. They all have their own little noises that they make that are different than the others. And the same is true of the space shuttles. If you flew on Endeavour, you flew on Discovery, they were also all slightly different in their own way. They're very unique. And that everything from the tile patterns to just sort of their the scents and the sounds and all of that on the inside for the astronauts was different. And so it's kind of cool to think about people who have flown multiple space shuttles and how they have a slightly different experience on each of them, even though to us, the general observer, they look the same.
Yes, and that's a fantastic point to make, really, isn't it? Because quirks, especially of essentially bespoke spacecraft, are going to be slightly different, even though the spec will be the same. They're all going to change slightly over time.
Yeah, the big difference is between the first set of vehicles. So there is we sort of look at them in 2 generations in a sense. The first generation being Enterprise, Columbia, and Challenger. Those were the first 3 built. And then Discovery, Endeavour, and Atlantis in that second group. And so Endeavour being sort of the last of those has slightly different build. Discovery and Atlantis are fairly similar in their build, but the first three vehicles, Enterprise, Columbia, and Challenger, were actually quite a bit heavier. So this sort of, you can't see it from the outside, but what you would have seen on the inside is certainly a more bulky vehicle. We did reinforce the floor in this building to house Discovery, but it might have been slightly different if we'd had one of those other vehicles here. And Enterprise really wasn't a very complete vehicle, so there's not really much of thankfully, a difference between having either of those two here. So, but one of the things that does make it kind of an interesting story too is that during 2003, when the research began after the loss of Columbia, is that Enterprise was the only vehicle left that could provide any historical equivalent to what had happened. It had the original carbon panels on the wing. They were the same, basically the same model, the same build circumstances as the ones that had been on Columbia. So what we did as the Smithsonian was we allowed NASA to do research on those. They actually came, removed the panels that were appropriate to the Columbia investigation, took those back to their research facilities and utilized those in testing so that they could really get a really obvious sense of how did an impact actually potentially do damage to that particular thing. So even as a sort of a historic item, Enterprise played its own role in something that was going on in the moment, and it's kind of special to think that that's even possible in these kinds of vehicles that do, like I said, seem all the same, but really do have different characteristics in their own way.
Great case for preservation.
Absolutely, yeah. We always want to make sure we know what we've done in the past.
I think that I'm going to go aesthetics here. You guys do cheat when you walk in because you go immediately through the door, SR-71, and then the second thing you see is this. So the two great sort of speed demons of...
For sure, yeah. I think this blows the SR-71 out of the water a little bit. This one about Mach 25 on re-entry.
Just a touch, yeah.
But what's really kind of a cool story that I uncovered a few years ago is that I had an opportunity to interview Pam Melroy when she was still at NASA, and in looking through her biography, I had never realized that as part of her military experience, she'd been on the refueling aircraft for SR-71s. So she actually had the perspective you get when you walk into our building. She'd had the perspective of looking down or looking back at an SR-71, but she'd also had the perspective of looking at the space shuttle. So it's just a kind of surreal thing to think about how compatible and in a lot of ways we can talk about these vehicles, aircraft and the space shuttle in the same language, I guess you could say, because it is shaped like an aircraft. It was meant to land on runways, so it had to have features like an aircraft. The delta wings are things that are seen on other aircraft. If you take a look at the Concorde, it might look a little familiar based on that. So yeah, so there are some features, and of course the initial testing of Enterprise was all done in the atmosphere. It had to land and glide into a landing, so there's a lot of common ground there.
The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona is home to one of the largest non-government funded aviation and space museums in the world. Featuring nearly 400 aircraft, the museum is home to an incredible collection, like NASA's NB-52 X-15 dropship and 747 SP Sophia Airborne Observatory, to a wealth of rare military types from air forces all around the world, to the first production 777. Whether you're a military or civilian aviation geek, there will be an incredible aircraft around every corner of this epic 80-acre site for you to explore. As the Aviation Show's partnership with the Pima Air and Space Museum enters its third year, we're delighted to say that Pima is truly a top of your bucket list museum to visit. And it keeps getting better, as this year the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum will be opening right next door. To find out more about the incredible collection and the fantastic events coming up at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and of course the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, head over to www.pimaair.org to plan your trip to one of the world's great aviation collections, and one that now includes tanks next door, if that's your sort of thing.
Let's go around and look at the angle that not everybody gets to see, which is the engines, because most of the pictures of these things are of the nice shiny white bits with the names. And so, it's all right. But
From the nose to the top.
because I suppose the one thing at Intrepid is it's very dark, so you don't get quite the
True.
same
Yeah.
response. But then when you get to walk around here and then just see the enormity of those engines.
Yeah, they are enormous. They are not quite as big as an F1 that would have that launched the Saturn V's to go on the Apollo missions, but they are incredibly advanced. One thing that these engines could do that Apollo F1 engines did not do is throttle. So you can imagine throttling even when you're changing the speed of your car. You could change the speed of the space shuttle by throttling these engines, and so that was a huge difference from what the capabilities were back on Apollo, because you needed to do certain procedures in order not to shake the vehicle apart during launch. And these engines, the other thing that's not really commonly realized, is these engines are only used for liftoff. They are never used once the vehicle reaches orbit, and that's because there's no fuel left. The tank that would have been attached to the vehicle, the external tank, once that tank is empty of fuel, it's all over. The fuel and oxidizer come through these panels on the bottom of the vehicle. There are connection points inside there that basically feed the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen up into the engines. And when that fuel tank would drop away, that was the end of those engines and their use. The rest of the maneuvering is all done with the different maneuvering engines that are on the vehicle. They're much smaller rocket engines. Even when they were ready to come back, they were using those smaller engines to get the right angle to do re-entry.
Because it's the same sort of system as on the lunar lander as well. That was the first throttleable rocket, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's good question, and I don't remember the exact answer to that, but there were capabilities in some of those, and these are the first throttleable ones for a launch vehicle, we'll say it that way. So quite a bit different than the F1 engines, really huge. These nozzles, I mentioned that we took out some of the parts of the vehicle when or NASA took out some of the engine components, like the turbo pumps were all removed when it was getting ready to be delivered here. But these nozzles are real nozzles. One of the things that's kind of a cool feature of Space Shuttle main engines, or RS-25s, is that you could change out all the parts just like you can change in your automobile. So my car is in the shop right now. I've got a weird clicking noise in my engine, and so something needs to be replaced. And the same kind of thing was possible with these engines. In fact, after every single mission, they would be removed with a giant crane and serviced just like you would service an engine. These got serviced every single time. So imagine driving your car on a long trip and then coming back and having a service done every single time you do that. It's kind of the same idea of having to maintain something that's incredibly intricate, important, critical. There were engine losses during launches. There were a few launches where engines cut out. That was not ideal, but it could make it to orbit still on just 2 engines. If they'd gone down to 1 engine, they would have had to abort and come back to a landing site. That never happened, thankfully. They all made it to orbit. Other problems did make it so that they had to come back really early, but not because of the engines.
Because we think of the 2 that were lost, but when you think of the number of flights, remarkable record for the fleet.
Yeah, 133 successful launches and landings is pretty incredible. It makes it, on a mathematical side, seem a lot different. I mean, that's certainly no way to really look at what has happened or the sort of integrity of the design of the shuttle. I mean, I would challenge anyone who thinks that this is a great design. It did not work out the way that was planned. And that's part of coming to understand how we, as humans, build technology, is there are always going to be compromises that to achieve one goal, you may have to give up on another goal. And so we often talk about the space shuttle orbiters as a design of compromise. There needed to be compromises between not only engineers, but also the big entities that were funding the space shuttle. The military was a huge funder, especially the Air Force, of the design of this. They wanted a very large payload bay to take different kinds of satellites up into orbit. NASA would have preferred certain things to be different to achieve their own goals, and so people kind of had to come together on something they thought would work, and there were certainly a number of compromises made that we now know led to the loss of both Columbia and Challenger. And so that's where you have to look back at other reasons. And I think both of the accident investigations pointed directly at managerial decision making as part of the problem. So there, if you want to think of it as human error, there were certainly human errors that went into those two incidents in particular. And of course, that's, it's incredibly devastating. But I think it hopefully indicates a better way forward on the way in which teams manage these kinds of projects.
So over here,
one of Discovery's payloads at some point. So this is Space Lab.
And some fantastic J.J. Abrams lens flare going on there as well.
Absolutely. Can't go without some lens flare in this building. So Space Lab is really one of the best examples that we can speak to of something that kind of indicates where we ended up going with the Space Shuttle program, and that's moving towards more science and the International Space Station in particular. So you can think of Space Lab as one of the first modules of some kind of a space station. It just never went anywhere. It stayed inside the payload bay of the orbiter. And this is Space Lab number 1. Number 2 is in Europe. But Space Lab number 1 was used on a bunch of missions to do different kinds of science research. And inside are what we think of as racks. And so there's sort of 4 surfaces, just like you would think of, say, a hallway or any kind of a room. There's a floor, a ceiling, a left and a right side. Of course, those all have technical NASA terms for them. But in each of those spaces, you could put different components, pieces of equipment that would be for engineering and science research. And so this is really a mock-up or a model of what ends up happening with the modules that are now on the space station today. And of course, those were carried in the payload bay of the shuttle. Yep. So this really provided a number of different opportunities to kind of get ready for what came in the late 1990s with building the station.
Yeah, and that's sort of one of the key elements that we think of is that ever-present station in the sky now.
Yeah.
All went up in lots and lots of different pieces in the back of the shuttle fleet. Mm-hmm. And it's not something we could do now.
Probably not something we could do now, in part because from a relatively early stage in thinking about a space station in the 1980s, NASA came to realize it needed help. It can't do these things alone. It was envisioned as a very large project, and you need partners for that. And so the Canadians came on board very early. We walked past the Canada arm, and you can see it from here. Canada was the first.
Bit of kit.
Yeah, it's a brilliant contribution. As someone from Michigan, I can appreciate the Canadian investment in the space program for sure. So, as an addition to that then starts to begin a sort of ball rolling of let's acquire more international partners to not only involve other nations and get their companies to contribute technological innovation, but also to excite more people, because the more countries involved in this, the more individuals around the world who feel invested in the accomplishments, the research, and all those kinds of things. So then the Japanese come on board, and by the 1990s, with the fall of the Soviet Union, it became incredibly apparent that the successor nation, Russia, would become involved in some kind of an international space station program. And without the Russians, the space station would certainly look quite a bit different. They launched a fair number of modules that are still on the space station today. And so this, it's not just a technological achievement, it's really a diplomatic achievement in many ways, that the idea that you could bring all of these countries, 15 countries together, to produce this huge, like soccer field size station in space, built on the ground but assembled in space, is probably an unparalleled thing, certainly in our history to this point, but potentially going forward too, at least for the foreseeable future.
So let's do the Sophie's Choice question. You have an incredible collection that you get to take care of. I'm going to put the camera on you. What's your favorite bit?
Well, it's hard not to love the space shuttle because it is iconic in its own way. I'm a big fan of what's called the Manned Maneuvering Unit, which hovers right here next to Discovery. This is unit number 3 that was flown by Bruce McCandless just over 41 years ago now.
So is that the one in the famous photo?
It is the one in the famous photo, and it was the privilege of my life, certainly, to get the opportunity to speak to him on a few occasions, and then later, after he passed away, collect some items from his own history to be part of the collection here. And so to connect these stories in that way is really kind of always makes me feel really proud of the way in which we go about our work as curators, is to think about these stories not only of technology, but the people who really made it work. It's, you know, these things don't happen on their own. They don't, the space shuttle theoretically could fly itself. You could fly it robotically potentially, but that really means somebody on the ground is still operating. So who's that person on the ground operating it? People can't be taken out of this story, and so being able to tell more stories about people and how they are involved in spaceflight is always a real privilege, and is always really fun. But I have to say, one of my favorite things is actually in my collection is an IMAX camera. So there's an IMAX camera that flew on Discovery's first mission, and I got to collect that in 2012 from the IMAX Corporation. Another Canadian contribution to our wonderful spaceflight story. But as a kid, I remember going and seeing The Dream is Alive when I was a child, and just being completely overwhelmed that I could feel like I was actually in space because of that. And so when I had the opportunity to meet Graham Ferguson, who invented the camera, and Tony Myers, who was the director of that film, I was just kind of beside myself a bit. And so even today, I saw the camera just last week in our conservation lab. It's being prepared for a new display. And it was just sort of like coming home in a weird way, of seeing something that really felt really familiar to me, and it was really special for my career, but also the story of the museum, because the museum was actually played a role in those early IMAX films. And so I felt like I was really getting an opportunity to bring together a really unusual but rewarding story about spaceflight, is how we can all collaborate and make these amazing products and be invested in telling the stories. And that's kind of how I look at my job, really.
I remember seeing that at Kennedy, and the escape bit, just where they go down the. Oh,
it really, it really, seeing an IMAX movie, especially some of those early ones in those days, I think really altered a lot of our perspectives on how hard it is to do this work. It is not simple. I do a lot of interviews, and I talked just today about spacewalks and how difficult they are. And every time I do an interview on it, it just kind of increases my awareness for how difficult all of it is. To train to be an astronaut is no easy thing. It's intense. It requires an incredible amount of patience and hard work. Something I can feel familiar with because I have the same things, but in no way would I ever be prepared to put myself through the physical changes that happen to the body in space. I think that's where I draw my limit and say I belong here on the ground. But it's really been pretty special to think about what's important in this story and how can I go about helping preserve that story by collecting something to have in the Smithsonian's collections. It's not an opportunity many people get.
I'm just really jealous. Chatting to you, Malcolm, about all this stuff. I think we walked past the camera in the lab. We might have. But yeah, you guys seem to have far too much fun.
We do, and I think that's been one of the great things about being here for now 20, I'm coming up on 23 years this summer, is the atmosphere here amongst staff is that we are all on a mission together to do the same thing. We're really contributing to the preservation of stories that are incredibly unique in American history. I am an American history student. I have a PhD in American history. I've loved learning stories about our country's history, but there is something different about these stories. There's something that is inspiring in a different way, and so it's just kind of a uniquely unusual opportunity to be involved in it. And I think we all feel that every day when we come to work and spend time together and working in the conservation lab. Most of those folks there would tell you that I love being there because they're contributing a completely different part of the story. They're looking at the materials, they're looking at the chemical composition of things, and that's beyond my knowledge range. But I love hearing about it. I love thinking about how we can take steps now to save things for my children's 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 children. And that's really how I look at my job, is that it's not about today, our visit, our talk today. It's really about how that will maybe play a role in somebody seeing this 100 or 500 years from now.
Great.
I suspect people who lived 100 and 500 years ago didn't think the same way about things in terms of preserving them, but we're at a really unique moment where for the last 100 plus years, people have been putting things in places called museums and coming to look at them in this way. And you mentioned scale earlier. I will say that's one of the biggest challenges we face in our institute, in this particular part of the Smithsonian, is our things are very large. It is incredibly difficult to tell a story about the space shuttle without having the external tank or the solid rocket boosters here. But what was really fabulous about the conversation in around 2010 and 11 and 12 was how each of the museums who now are home to one of those space shuttle orbiters could tell a part of that story. We each kind of get a little piece of that story for ourselves. We tell the whole stories, but then there's a kind of unique niche part of that we each get to kind of develop. So out in California, at the California Science Center, you learn more about the launch of the vehicle. Down at the Kennedy Space Center, you learn a lot more about orbital operations because of the way the vehicle is displayed. Here you learn a little bit more about maintenance, about preservation in particular. Discovery is still the most complete of all of the remaining orbiters, and so we are what we think of as the vehicle of record. If NASA or any of its future incarnations or future engineers wanted to study an orbiter, this would be the one they would come to see because it has the least amount removed from it. And I can't neglect Enterprise, as Enterprise tells this testing story of how we even knew that this thing could land on a runway. So everybody has their own little piece, and it's a nice collaborative effort in a way. It's not seen, it's definitely not visible, but we all really know what our part in that story is.
So you ship the big Enterprise out to New York and you put the fantastic one on display downtown.
Yeah, this is, it's that's one of the things that's true about spaceflight, is it's part of a continuum of exploration, and that'll continue to go on. To think about how these, our stories are all part of a big, extensive story of exploration. In my PhD work, I even looked at how some of these things that we see today connect back to Antarctic exploration or exploration of the American West. You can see themes throughout history, and we tend to cycle through some of the same ideas and same ways of doing things through time, and spaceflight's no different.
Yeah, and let's just come over here to the board, because the shout out that we have to do is for Colonel Collins, of course.
Most definitely.
Made her first flight.
Yeah, she made.
On Discovery.
Yeah, she piloted the space shuttle. She commanded Space Shuttle Discovery. She's really probably one of my favorite people to get the chance to work with and talk to about her time on the space shuttle. A few years ago, we had her here during her book tour, and I had the opportunity to film with her. We basically went around Discovery, and I would just point at something, and she would tell me more about it. And it was such a privilege to really get that up. Really, it felt up close and personal with a vehicle that I get to come see a lot here in the museum, but I didn't really know the same way she knows it.
I love that bit in her book when she's going through her post-launch checklist, and the commander says, "Eileen, stop, look out the window."
Yeah, absolutely.
And she was so focused on getting the job perfect.
It's true, and that's really, I think that happens to almost everybody that goes to space, as far as I understand it, is it really takes, they've been training and been so intent on their goals, and every single one of them also goes through that moment of, I am in a completely different place in this universe right now. You're really only about 250 miles above the surface of the Earth, which does not seem like very far, but it really is quite far when you think about the differences between those places. And so her stories are always, I really very much appreciate them as this sort of innovator in her own way that she was, sort of taking opportunities and taking chances and risks, and really, but really seeking to push things forward, to get to be a part of something like she's been is kind of unimaginable in a lot of ways. But somebody that certainly I look up to, obviously, in my role as a curator, but also as a woman in a field that doesn't typically, in many ways, have a lot of women in it. So it's just, I have a really great relationship with her, which is lovely.
Fantastic. Jennifer, thank you so much for taking a bit of your afternoon before having to do the school run.
Absolutely.
To chat with us.
No problem.
And your job is terrible.
I'd like to say thanks to all of our fantastic supporters over on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the fun from just £3 a month, plus a bit of VAT, get your name in these very credits, and get all the episodes ad-free and early as soon as I get the edit finished. The Aviation Show is hosted and produced by Matt Bone and is a Boney Abroad production.